October 13, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The jungle erupted with screaming as 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged through the darkness toward the American perimeter. Bayonets glinted in the moonlight. Officers waved samurai swords overhead. The banzai attack, the same tactic that had overwhelmed Allied positions across the Pacific for 10 brutal months, was about to slam into something it had never encountered before. On the American line, soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, North Dakota National Guardsmen who had arrived on the island just that morning, raised their rifles. But these were not the bolt-action Springfields that other American units carried. These men held a weapon the Army had rejected again and again for nearly 2 decades. A weapon designed by an immigrant with no engineering degree. A weapon that was about to change the entire war. The first wave of Japanese soldiers broke from the tree line at a dead sprint, and then the Americans opened fire. The sound was unlike anything the enemy had heard. Not the deliberate crack of bolt-action rifles. Instead, a continuous roar of semi-automatic fire rippled across the line. 8 rounds in under 4 seconds. Reload. 8 more. The charging soldiers fell in rows, cut down faster than any defensive position had managed in the entire Pacific campaign. By dawn, over 900 Japanese bodies lay in front of the American positions. The survivors retreated in disbelief. The weapon that had been rejected 8 times had just saved the Pacific. The rifle was called the M1 Garand. It weighed 9.5 pounds, unloaded and measured 43.6 inches in overall length, with a 24-inch barrel. It fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same powerful round American soldiers had used since 1906. The muzzle velocity was approximately 2,800 feet per second, delivering tremendous energy at the muzzle. Effective range extended to 440 yards, according to the official field manual, though trained marksmen could hit targets well beyond that distance. But unlike every other standard infantry rifle in the world at that time, the M1 was semi-automatic. Pull the trigger, and it fired. Pull again, and it fired again. No working a bolt. No breaking your aim. No taking your eye off the enemy to cycle another round into the chamber. No fumbling with the bolt handle while enemy soldiers closed the distance. The M1 held 8 rounds in a unique device called an en-bloc clip, a stamped steel container that held the ammunition in a staggered double stack. You inserted the entire clip into the top of the receiver. The bolt closed over it automatically, and then you could fire all 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger. When the last round fired, the clip ejected automatically with a distinctive metallic ping, and you could reload in 2 to 3 seconds with a fresh clip. The rifle used a gas-operated system with a long-stroke piston and a rotating bolt. Propellant gases were tapped from a port drilled in the barrel and pushed against an operating rod that cycled the action, extracting the spent case and chambering a fresh round automatically. The design was remarkably simple for a semi-automatic weapon, with fewer parts than competing designs, and greater reliability in adverse conditions. The rate of fire was transformative in ways that changed infantry tactics forever. A skilled soldier with a bolt-action rifle, whether American, German, British, or Japanese, could fire perhaps 10 to 15 aimed rounds per minute under ideal conditions. A trained rifleman with the M1 Garand could deliver up to 40 or even 50 aimed rounds in the same time. In practical terms, every American rifleman now had the firepower of 3 or 4 enemy soldiers. An American rifle platoon could generate the same volume of suppressive fire as an entire company armed with bolt-action weapons. This advantage would prove decisive on battlefields from the Pacific Islands to the hedgerows of Normandy. No other nation in the world equipped its standard infantry with semi-automatic rifles during World War II. Germany issued some G43 rifles, but only to designated marksmen and special units, never for general issue to regular infantry. The Soviets produced the SVT-40 in limited numbers, but found it too difficult to maintain in field conditions, and eventually reverted to bolt actions for most troops. Japan and Britain and Italy relied entirely on bolt-action designs that dated back decades to the previous century. The United States was a generation ahead in small arms technology, and every American soldier in the Pacific and Europe carried that decisive advantage in his hands every single day of the war. But getting there had taken 17 years of struggle, failure, political battles, budget crises, and one stubborn immigrant who refused to give up no matter how many times the army said no. John Garand was born on January 1, 1888, on a small farm near St. Remy, Quebec, about 17 miles south of Montreal in French Canada. He was one of 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls, born to John Garand, a farmer who struggled to provide for his large family in the harsh Quebec climate. His last name rhymed with errand, not Grand, a pronunciation confirmed by his family descendants and his close colleague General Julian Hatcher, who worked with him for many years at Springfield Armory. The Garand family lived modestly on their small Quebec farm. Life was hard, money was scarce, the winters were brutal, and the growing season short. When Jean was still a young boy, his mother died. The loss devastated the entire household. His father, unable to support 12 children alone on the struggling farm, made the difficult decision to move the family south across the border to Connecticut in 1898, seeking better opportunities in the industrial economy of New England, where the textile mills were hungry for workers. Young Jean's formal education ended early, cut short by the economic necessity of finding work to help support his large family. He took a job as a bobbin boy and floor sweeper at Slater's Mill in Connecticut, one of the lowest positions available in the factory hierarchy. He earned pennies per day doing the dirtiest work in the factory, cleaning machinery and replacing the bobbins that held thread in the spinning machines. He learned English from his co-workers on the factory floor, picking up the language word by word while he worked alongside them. He had no formal engineering education, not a single day of technical training, not a single class in mechanical design or metallurgy or ballistics. Everything he knew about metalworking, machining, forging, and mechanical design he taught himself by watching the skilled machinists at work in the mill and experimenting with tools during his limited free time. He would observe craftsmen at their lathes and mills, memorizing their techniques with his remarkable visual memory, then practicing on his own during off hours and weekends until he could replicate their work. Yet before his 18th birthday, John Garand had already patented 2 inventions. One was a telescopic screwjack. The other was an automatic bobbin winding machine that improved on designs used throughout the textile industry. The self-taught immigrant with no formal education was already proving he could solve mechanical problems that stumped trained engineers with university degrees. His mind worked differently, seeing solutions where others saw only obstacles. Around 1909, Garand joined Brown & Sharp in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the premier precision manufacturing companies in all of America. The company was famous throughout the industrial world for producing the highest quality measuring instruments and machine tools. Garand designed gauges during the revolution in precision manufacturing, driven by the rapidly growing automobile industry, which demanded ever more accurate components. His reputation as a brilliant and innovative designer spread through the tight-knit community of American machinists and engineers who recognized exceptional talent. He developed a passionate interest in firearms during these years that would shape the rest of his life. The Garand family had lived near a gun club range back in Connecticut, and shooters routinely left their rifles at the family home for convenient storage between sessions. One of his brothers ran a shooting gallery. Gene spent his evenings at Broadway target ranges in New York City, studying how guns worked, how they failed under stress, and how they might be improved through better engineering. He analyzed every mechanism, every spring, every part, understanding each function and how it related to the whole. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Garand saw his opportunity to contribute to the war effort and advance his career. He submitted a design for a light machine gun to the War Department, one of many such submissions from inventors and gunsmiths hoping to arm American soldiers heading to France. His design was selected from among the many submissions they received from across the country. On August 16, 1918, just months before the armistice ended the fighting in Europe, he was hired by the United States Bureau of Standards in Washington to perfect his machine gun design for possible military use. He completed a working prototype by spring of 1919. It was too late for the war in Europe, which had ended the previous November. But his remarkable talent had been recognized by the men who controlled military procurement and would shape the future of American weapons development. On November 4, 1919, John Garand transferred to Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, the historic arsenal that had produced American military weapons since 1794 and had armed soldiers from the Revolution through the Civil War to the trenches of France. He would spend the next 34 years there, eventually rising to chief engineer at $8,000 per year, the highest paid engineer at the entire government facility. The army wanted a semi-automatic rifle badly. Officers who had served in France had seen the carnage of World War I firsthand, where machine guns and artillery had made charging infantry nearly suicidal. Entire generations of young men from Britain, France, and Germany had been slaughtered advancing across no man's land against entrenched positions defended by automatic weapons. American military thinkers understood that giving every soldier increased firepower could transform the battlefield fundamentally, breaking the stalemate that had characterized the Western Front. The question was whether any semi-automatic design could be reliable enough, rugged enough, and economical enough for mass production and general issue to millions of soldiers. Previous semi-automatic rifles from various inventors had been temperamental and prone to jamming in field conditions. They were difficult to manufacture, with the precision required for reliable function. They were expensive compared to proven bolt-action designs that had served armies well for decades. Many experienced officers doubted that the mechanical complexity required for semi-automatic operation could ever be made robust enough for the mud and dirt and rough handling of infantry combat. Garand began working on rifle designs almost immediately after arriving at Springfield. His first attempts used a novel mechanism where gases from the cartridge primer, not the main propellant charge, cycled the action. This primer-actuated system was innovative and unconventional but completely unproven in military service. The Model 1920, tested at Springfield Armory in May of that year, was deemed unsatisfactory by the examining board. The mechanism was unreliable under stress. Parts broke during extended firing. Garand went back to his workshop to analyze every failure and understand exactly what had gone wrong. The Model 1921 performed significantly better in testing and was sent to Fort Benning and Fort Riley for evaluation by troops in actual field conditions. The results were encouraging but not yet conclusive. More development work was clearly needed before the rifle could be considered for adoption as a standard military weapon. Springfield Armory then built 24 rifles for comprehensive testing at Fort Benning in 1925 against competing designs from Berthier, Hatcher-Bang, Thompson, and Pedersen. Each design had its advocates among different army factions and branches. Each had its own particular flaws and limitations that emerged under testing. The results were inconclusive. No rifle emerged as clearly superior to all the others, and the evaluation process continued. In March 1927, cavalry board trials at Fort Riley ended with no clear winner among the competing designs. The horsemen could not agree on which rifle best suited their needs. The following year, in September 1928, the semi-automatic rifle board convened again and found no clear winner yet again. The evaluation process dragged on without resolution, while Garand continued refining his design. Then came the first major technical setback that threatened to derail Garand's entire approach. Around 1925, the Army adopted a new 30-caliber service cartridge, the 30 M1 ball, with a redesigned primer that used a different chemical composition and construction. This seemingly minor change in ammunition specifications rendered Garand's entire primer-actuated system unworkable. The gases from the new primer formulation were simply insufficient to reliably cycle his action. Years of development were suddenly obsolete through no fault of Garand's own design work. The Army's ammunition decision, made by an entirely different department without consulting rifle designers about the implications, had invalidated his entire operating principle. A lesser man might have given up in despair. Garand had spent years perfecting a mechanism that was now useless because of a decision completely outside his control. But he was not a lesser man. His determination had been forged in the textile mills of Connecticut. Garand pivoted to a gas-operated system, where propellant gases tapped from the barrel itself would cycle the action instead of relying on primer gases. It was a fundamentally different engineering approach that required extensive redesign of the entire mechanism. He was also instructed by his superiors to develop a version chambered in an experimental caliber called the .276 Pedersen, a 7x51mm cartridge being actively promoted as a lighter, lower recoil alternative to the traditional 30-caliber round that would allow soldiers to carry more ammunition. His .276 gas-operated rifle, designated the T3, competed against John Pedersen's toggle delayed blowback T1 rifle in joint Army-Navy-Marine Corps trials that would determine the future of American infantry weapons. Pedersen was a famous and well-connected gun designer who had worked for Remington Arms for many years and had designed the innovative Patton device that converted Springfield rifles to semi-automatic fire during the Great War. He had powerful allies and friends throughout the Ordnance Department. His rifle was elegant and beautifully engineered with fine craftsmanship. But Patton's design had critical weaknesses that became apparent under rigorous testing. It required waxed cartridge cases to function properly because the toggle action did not handle standard brass cases reliably. The wax created maintenance problems in dusty conditions. It had 99 parts compared to Garand's simpler mechanism, making it more complex to manufacture and more difficult to maintain in field conditions. And because Patton held a private contract with royalty provisions, adopting his rifle would cost the government ongoing payments for every weapon produced throughout the life of the program. Garand was a salaried government employee. The army owed him nothing beyond his regular paycheck, no matter how many rifles they built. In 1931, 20 T3E2 Garand rifles were built and evaluated by the Infantry Board, the Cavalry Board, and the Semi-Automatic Rifle Board in comprehensive trials that subjected the weapons to dust, mud, extreme temperatures, and prolonged firing. Garand won all three evaluations decisively. His rifle was simpler in construction with fewer parts to break or lose. It required no special ammunition treatment and worked with standard military cartridges. It was more reliable in adverse conditions, including dust, mud, rain, and extreme temperatures from desert heat to Arctic cold. And it came completely free of royalty obligations that would have cost the government millions of dollars over time. The choice seemed clear. On January 4, 1932, the board officially recommended adopting the .276 caliber and producing 125 T3E2 rifles for further testing and evaluation before full-scale production. The long development process finally appeared to be reaching its successful conclusion after more than a decade of work. Then everything changed with a single decision from the top. Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur personally vetoed any caliber change whatsoever. His reasoning was logistical and financial rather than technical. The Army held vast stockpiles of .30 caliber ammunition left over from World War I, literally millions of rounds sitting in warehouses and depots across the country. The Great Depression had devastated military budgets worse than at any time in American history. Congress was slashing appropriations ruthlessly as the nation struggled with massive unemployment. There was simply no money available to adopt both a new rifle and a new cartridge simultaneously when existing ammunition stocks could be used. On February 25, 1932, Adjutant General John B. Schumann issued orders that all work on .276 caliber rifles and ammunition was to cease immediately and completely. There would be no exceptions and no delays. Garand was directed to perfect the .30 caliber version of his rifle instead, using the existing .30-06 cartridge. Years of work on the .276 design were abandoned overnight with a single order. This was another rejection, another setback, another obstacle in a development process already filled with them. But Garand pressed forward once again without complaint or bitterness. He had already been redesigning the bolt mechanism for the .30 caliber version in anticipation of possible problems or changes in direction. His improved T1E2 passed retesting successfully with the more powerful cartridge that generated significantly higher chamber pressures. On August 3, 1933, the T1E2 was officially designated the semi-automatic rifle, caliber .30, M1. But the rifle was still not ready for actual production and issue to troops. Springfield Armory built 80 handmade model shop rifles for field testing in 1934. These carefully crafted prototypes were extraordinarily expensive, reflecting the intensive precision handwork required to make each prototype rifle function reliably when manufacturing processes had not yet been established. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground and various field units revealed weaknesses in the design that needed correction before mass production could begin. Bolt failures occurred under stress of repeated firing. Certain parts broke after extended use in harsh conditions. All 80 rifles were returned to Springfield in May 1935 for complete overhaul and modification to address the problems that testing had revealed. The critics in the Army grew louder and more vocal with each delay and setback. Some officers argued that the entire semi-automatic concept was fundamentally flawed and would never work reliably enough for military service. Others pushed for entirely different designs from other inventors. Melvin Johnson began promoting his own competing rifle design aggressively through articles and political connections. Garand and his engineering team at Springfield worked around the clock to address every identified problem systematically. They analyzed each failure, redesigned problematic components, and tested solutions thoroughly before implementing changes. Modified rifles, incorporating all the improvements past follow-up evaluations successfully. On November 7, 1935, the design was finally cleared for procurement after all modifications were validated through extensive testing. On January 9, 1936, the M1 was officially standardized as the United States Rifle Caliber 30 M1. It had taken 17 years from Garand's first rifle work at Springfield. He had overcome technical failures, forced caliber changes, political opposition from competing designers, budget constraints from the Depression, and competition from famous inventors with powerful friends throughout the military establishment. The immigrant, with no formal engineering degree, had outlasted them all through sheer determination and brilliant problem-solving. Production began slowly because the manufacturing process was extraordinarily complex for the era. The rifle required precision machining operations that pushed the capabilities of existing factory equipment beyond anything previously attempted for mass production of military weapons. The first production M1, serial number 81, was successfully proof-fired on July 21, 1937. Initial deliveries to the Army began in September 1937 at a rate of just 10 rifles per day. The 4th Infantry Division at Fort Benning received the first significant quantities for training and evaluation by actual soldiers who would use the weapon in combat. Then a new crisis emerged that threatened to end the rifle's career just as it was beginning. The original 1936 design used a gas trap system, a muzzle extension that captured propellant gas after the bullet exited the barrel entirely. In extended field use, this system proved deeply troublesome. Carbon fouling from burnt powder accumulated rapidly in the gas trap mechanism and caused malfunctions. Screws worked loose under the constant vibration of repeated firing. In one documented and frightening incident, the entire gas trap assembly blew completely off a rifle during rapid fire, nearly injuring the soldier firing it. The front sight, which was mounted on the gas trap assembly, became unstable and seriously affected accuracy. Roughly 48,000 gas trap rifles were produced before the problems became undeniable and impossible to ignore. Soldiers in the field reported constant malfunctions that undermined confidence in the new weapon. Unit armorers struggled desperately to keep the weapons functional for training. Critics attacked the rifle program with renewed vigor and determination. Melvin Johnson, designer of a competing semi-automatic rifle called the Johnson M1941, launched an aggressive lobbying campaign to replace the Garand with his own design. He wrote articles for military publications highlighting every single flaw in the M1. He cultivated allies in Congress and among disaffected military officers who preferred his design. The Marine Corps briefly tested Johnson rifles as an alternative to the troubled Garand. But Garand and the Springfield Armory engineering team worked frantically to solve the gas trap problems before the rifle could be cancelled. They analyzed every reported failure, traced every malfunction to its root cause, and redesigned every problematic component with meticulous attention to detail. In October 1939, an Ordnance Department committee officially recommended switching to a conventional drilled gas port in the barrel itself, eliminating the troublesome gas trap mechanism entirely. Engineering drawings were completed by March 1940. By midsummer 1940, all new production used the improved gas port system with a 24-inch barrel instead of the original 22-inch barrel. Existing gas trap rifles were recalled from units and retrofitted with the new system at government expense. The Johnson rifle was tested comprehensively, found wanting in reliability and durability compared to the improved Garand, and ultimately rejected after thorough evaluation. The M1 survived its final major challenge before the coming war. By January 1940, production had increased to 100 rifles per day. By January 1941, it reached 600 rifles per day as more workers were trained and additional machinery installed. The arsenal of democracy was beginning to stir awake as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Springfield Armory was producing about 600 rifles per day. It was nowhere near enough for the global war that had just engulfed America. Winchester Repeating Arms received an educational production contract and eventually delivered over 513,000 rifles between 1941 and 1945. Production at Springfield accelerated dramatically as new workers flooded into the factory from across New England. New machinery was installed around the clock, and manufacturing processes were continuously streamlined and improved through wartime necessity. By January 1942, Springfield alone was producing over 1,100 rifles per day. The production curve climbed relentlessly month after month as America's industrial might mobilized for total war. At the absolute peak in January 1944, Springfield produced 122,001 rifles in a single month. That was nearly 4,000 rifles per day, around the clock without stopping, 7 days a week. Unit cost dropped from roughly $85 early in wartime production to between $26 and $31 by 1945, through economies of scale and manufacturing efficiencies that would have seemed impossible before the war. Total World War II production reached approximately 4 million rifles from Springfield and Winchester combined. The M1 Garand went to war at last. Its first combat came in the Philippines during the Japanese invasion that began in mid-December 1941. When Japanese forces landed at Lingayen Gulf around December 22nd, soldiers of the 26th Cavalry Regiment of the Philippine Scouts engaged the enemy with their M1 Garands. These were among the very first shots fired by American forces with the new semi-automatic rifle in actual combat against enemy soldiers. The results were immediate and dramatic, even in defeat. On February 23, 1942, the Washington Post ran a headline reading, "Bataan proves Garand worth." The New York Times reported that General Douglas MacArthur himself had praised the rifle in official communications to Washington. MacArthur cabled the War Department with his assessment of the weapon under combat conditions. Under combat conditions, he reported, the M1 operated with no mechanical defects. When used in foxholes, it did not develop stoppages from dust or dirt. It had been in almost constant action for as much as a week without cleaning or lubrication. On February 24th, Major General Charles Wesson relayed MacArthur's praise to Winchester factory workers via telegram, boosting morale on the production lines. The same general who had vetoed the .276 caliber a decade earlier now championed the rifle that his decision had nearly derailed entirely. Bataan fell to the Japanese in April. The Philippines fell. American and Filipino soldiers endured the horrors of the Death March and years of brutal captivity, but the rifle itself had proven its worth under the worst conditions imaginable. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, the situation was more complicated. Marines who landed on August 7th primarily carried M1903 Springfields, the same bolt-action rifles their fathers had used in World War I. Production of M1 Garands had not yet reached levels sufficient to equip every unit in the rapidly expanding military. Only small numbers of Garands were present with the landing force, approximately 250 rifles with the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion. Then came October 13th, the day that would demonstrate the rifle's true value in the Pacific. The United States Army's 164th Infantry Regiment of the American Division landed on Guadalcanal. These were federalized North Dakota National Guardsmen, farmers and shopkeepers and clerks and teachers from small towns across the Great Plains who had been called to serve their country when the nation mobilized for war. They were fully equipped with M1 Garands, the first large unit to bring the new rifle to Guadalcanal in significant numbers. That very night, Japanese forces launched massive banzai attacks against Henderson Field, the vital airstrip that was the strategic prize of the entire Guadalcanal campaign and the key to controlling the Solomon Islands. 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged through the darkness of the jungle, screaming their battle cries, firing rifles, driving toward the American perimeter with bayonets fixed. Wave after wave of soldiers stormed toward the defensive positions in attacks that had overwhelmed other enemies from Malaya to the Philippines. The semi-automatic fire proved absolutely devastating against the human wave attacks. Lieutenant Colonel John B. George, who served with the 132nd Infantry Regiment of the American Division on Guadalcanal, later wrote about the M1 Garand in his 1947 memoir, Shots Fired in Anger. This rifle was probably the very best in the war, he declared, and the best military hand weapon ever placed on the battlefield. He called it the infantryman's perfect weapon. 5 shots, he noted pointedly, are not as good as 8. Marines fighting alongside the army soldiers were astonished by the firepower difference the Garands provided. They watched how quickly the soldiers could engage multiple targets, how the continuous semi-automatic fire suppressed enemy movement effectively, how the 8-round capacity allowed sustained accurate shooting without the constant reloading that bolt actions required. When the 1st Marine Division departed Guadalcanal in December 1942, after months of brutal combat, Army officers had to be stationed at embarkation points with an unusual mission. Their job was to confiscate stolen M1 Garands from departing Marines who had pilfered them from Army soldiers during the campaign. The Marines wanted those rifles badly enough to steal them and try to smuggle them out of the combat zone. The lesson was unmistakable. After refitting in Australia, the 1st Marine Division was fully re-equipped with M1 Garands for future operations. The 1943 Marine Division Table of Equipment called for over 7,400 M1s as the primary rifle. The Springfield bolt action was relegated to sniper duties and grenade launcher use only. Through Tarawa in November 1943 with its horrific beach casualties, through Saipan and Guam in the summer of 1944, through Peleliu with its caves and bunkers, through the black sands of Iwo Jima where Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, and finally through the massive campaign on Okinawa in 1945, the M1 Garand was the standard rifle of American forces throughout the Pacific War. Japanese infantry tactics began to change dramatically in response to the American firepower advantage. Banzai charges, which had succeeded spectacularly against British forces in Malaya and Dutch forces in the East Indies when those troops were armed with bolt-action rifles, proved suicidal against American semi-automatic fire. Charging Japanese infantry simply could not close the distance against the sheer volume of accurate rounds that American defenders could deliver in the crucial seconds of an assault. By Peleliu in September 1944, the Japanese had largely abandoned frontal assault tactics entirely in favor of defense in depth, from caves and bunkers and heavily fortified positions that had to be reduced one by one. Military historians have argued persuasively that this fundamental tactical shift was driven at least partly by the demonstrated futility of charging directly into Garand-armed American troops. The .30-06 round offered a critical advantage in jungle warfare that frontline soldiers quickly recognized. Its power allowed it to penetrate thick tropical undergrowth and vegetation that completely stopped the lighter .30 caliber carbine round. Many Marines who had been issued M1 carbines traded them for Garands, or acquired Garands through unofficial channels, specifically for this brush-cutting capability that could reach enemies hidden behind foliage. The Japanese military recognized the M1 Garand's clear superiority in the field. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in 1944, Japanese engineers began developing the Type 4 rifle as an Imperial Japanese Navy project. It was a reverse-engineered adaptation of the M1 Garand mechanism rechambered for the Japanese 7.7mm cartridge. The Japanese version used a 10-round integral box magazine fed by stripper clips instead of the American en-bloc clip system. Only about 250 were partially manufactured, and approximately 125 were actually assembled before the war ended, with Japan's surrender in August 1945. The rifles had persistent reliability problems during Japanese development and testing, with jamming issues that were never fully resolved despite their engineers' efforts. None reached combat use. The enemy had recognized American superiority and tried to copy the rifle. They failed to make it work reliably. The Type 4's very existence serves as a historical tribute to how badly Japan wanted what America already possessed. In Europe, the story unfolded similarly. American soldiers faced German troops armed primarily with the K-98K, a bolt-action Mauser design that had served Germany faithfully since the 1930s. The individual firepower advantage in any engagement was roughly 3-to-1 in terms of sustainable aimed rate of fire from a single rifleman. German infantry doctrine compensated for this disadvantage by centering squad firepower on the fearsome MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, with ordinary riflemen serving primarily in a supporting role to feed ammunition belts and protect the gun crews. But in close combat, in the deadly hedgerow fighting of Normandy, where visibility was measured in yards, in the brutal urban warfare of German towns and cities where enemies lurked around every corner, The American rifleman held a decisive personal firepower edge that German infantry could not match. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the legendary commander of the Third Army, wrote a letter on January 26, 1945. It was addressed to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., Chief of Ordnance for the United States Army. The letter was written on official Third Army Office of the Commanding General letterhead. The original document is preserved today at the Library of Congress. In my opinion, Patton wrote clearly, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was not a speech delivered to inspire troops before battle. It was not a casual remark made to journalists seeking quotations. It was a deliberate, carefully considered, written endorsement from one of the most demanding and harshly critical generals in all of American military history, a commander who did not praise easily. There is a famous myth about the M1 Garand that deserves careful examination for historical accuracy. The rifle's en-bloc clip makes a distinctive metallic ping sound when it ejects automatically after the 8th round is fired. According to popular legend, repeated in countless films and games, enemy soldiers learned to listen carefully for this telltale sound and would rush American positions when they heard it, knowing the rifleman was temporarily empty and vulnerable during his reload. The most authoritative evidence on this specific question comes from a 1952 study conducted by the Operations Research Office at Johns Hopkins University as part of Project Doughboy. Researchers formally surveyed exactly 315 Korean War combat veterans, specifically about their experiences with and opinions about the ping sound. 187 respondents, representing 59%, found the ping actually helpful as a clear signal that it was time to reload. 85 respondents, representing 27%, thought it could theoretically help the enemy in some circumstances. 43 respondents, representing 14%, said it was of no importance either way in actual combat. Former German soldiers formally interviewed after the war said the ping was generally completely inaudible during actual combat engagements with their deafening noise. Consider the reality of infantry combat. In the deafening noise of battle, with simultaneous fire from dozens of squad weapons, constant explosions from artillery and mortars, chattering machine guns, and the severely degraded hearing that inevitably comes from firing powerful .30 caliber rounds repeatedly without any hearing protection, isolating one single rifle's clip ejection sound at any tactically meaningful distance was impractical. Soldiers also fought in squads and platoons, not as isolated individuals. Even if one man's rifle was momentarily empty during his 2-second reload, his squadmates were absolutely not empty. Rushing one empty rifle meant running directly into multiple loaded ones. The myth was amplified enormously by the 1998 film Saving Private Ryan and by countless subsequent video games that featured the M1. But there is no verified historical evidence whatsoever of enemy soldiers successfully exploiting the ping sound to attack reloading Americans in actual documented combat. The M1 Garand proved beyond doubt that semi-automatic fire was viable as standard infantry armament for mass armies. This was a revolutionary concept that many military establishments around the world had dismissed for decades as inherently wasteful and mechanically unreliable for common soldiers. Conservative generals had worried endlessly that soldiers armed with semi-automatic weapons would simply blaze away wildly, exhausting their ammunition supply rapidly without hitting anything useful. The actual experience of World War II proved these concerns wrong. American soldiers did not waste their ammunition recklessly when given greater firepower. Instead, they used their firepower advantage intelligently to suppress enemy positions effectively, to break up developing attacks before they could build momentum, and to dominate firefights decisively through superior volume of accurate fire. The rifle's enormous influence rippled across the entire world in the years and decades that followed. Germany accelerated development of the G43 semi-automatic rifle and the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle concept that would influence small arms design for generations. The Soviet Union later developed the S carbine and the legendary AK-47 that would arm communist forces worldwide. Italy produced Garands under direct license and developed the BM-59, essentially a product-improved M1, with a 20-round detachable box magazine and selective fire capability. Over 40 different nations eventually received M1 Garands through American military aid programs during the long Cold War. In the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the M1 remained the backbone of American infantry, fighting in brutal winter conditions that tested both men and equipment. An official Army commentary on weapons performance stated clearly that of all weapons carried by the infantry in Korea, the M1 appeared to be least sensitive to heavy frost, extreme cold, and severe icing conditions. Staff Sergeant Darrell Powers, whose distinguished service with Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was memorably depicted in the acclaimed television series Band of Brothers, offered his own assessment of the rifle he had carried through combat in Europe. "The most amazing thing about that M1, he stated simply, is you could throw that thing down in a mud hole, drag it through the mud, pick it up, and it would fire." John Garand retired from Springfield Armory on April 30, 1953, after 34 years of devoted government service. His official awards included the Medal for Merit, personally awarded on March 28 of 1944, which was among the first ever awarded, and was at that time the highest civilian decoration the United States could bestow. He also received the prestigious Alexander L. Holly Medal from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. A congressional bill was introduced to award him $100,000 in formal recognition for his extraordinary contribution to national defense during the greatest war in human history. The bill failed to pass. He never received a single dollar in royalties for the rifle that bore his name and had armed millions of American soldiers across 2 major wars. Every one of his 54 firearms-related patents had been signed over to the United States government, completely without compensation of any kind. He had worked faithfully as a government employee, drawn his modest salary, and the government owned everything he invented. Upon his retirement, he was presented ceremonially with the 1 millionth M1 Garand produced at Springfield Armory, at a ceremony at the Kimball Hotel in Springfield on April 30, 1953, authorized by Secretary of the Army Robert T. Stevens. That historic rifle later sold at auction at Rock Island Auction Company in September 2018 for $287,500, setting a world record for an M1 Garand. John Garand died on February 16, 1974, in Springfield, Massachusetts, the city where he had worked for over 3 decades. He was 86 years old. He was inducted into the United States Army Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame in 1973, the year before his death. The M1 was officially replaced by the M14 rifle, which was adopted in 1957. The M14 was itself a direct linear descendant of the Garand design. Springfield Armory officially considered it a product-improved M1 rifle, retaining the proven gas-operated rotating bolt mechanism, while adding a detachable 20-round box magazine and new chambering for the 7.62 NATO cartridge. Full changeover from the Garand to the M14 throughout the entire American military was not actually completed until 1965. The M1 remained in active reserve and National Guard service into the 1970s. Today it continues proudly in the hands of military ceremonial drill teams, including the elite Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon, where the rifle's solid construction makes it ideal for the demanding and precise rifle handling routines that have thrilled audiences for many decades. Total lifetime production across all 4 manufacturers reached approximately 5.4 million M1 Garands. The very last service rifle was assembled at Springfield Armory on May 17, 1957, ending more than 2 full decades of continuous production. From a rejected prototype to the standard arm of the greatest military force the world had ever seen. From a self-taught immigrant working in a Connecticut textile mill to the creator of a weapon that changed the nature of infantry combat forever. The M1 Garand represented the best of American innovation. It was not created by a famous inventor with unlimited resources. It was created by a man who learned his craft by watching others and practicing alone. It was perfected through 17 years of setbacks that would have broken most men. It was produced by the millions through the industrial might of a nation at war. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Lieutenant Colonel George called it the best military hand weapon ever placed on the battlefield. The soldiers who carried it simply called it the rifle that kept them alive. John Garand never received the fortune his invention might have earned in private industry. He served his adopted country faithfully, gave it the weapon it needed, and asked for nothing more than his government salary in return. 8 times the army said no. 8 times John Garand went back to work, and in the end his rifle helped save the world.